In a recent video, I gave you 10 Overwatch League players who played better after joining a new team, and the general reception was really good. But something I noticed is a lot of you started asking the opposite question. What are some of the biggest flop signings in trades in Overwatch League history? Sometimes it can be very hard to explain why players suffer as much as they do after joining a new team. It could be a scheme fit thing, personal issues, getting washed, or things that are completely out of their control. Everybody has their reasons. But who is the cream of the crop? Well, that's what I'm here to answer. Here are 10 players who got worse after joining a new team. And of course, I encourage you to join me down in the comments below, as there's surely some guys I'm gonna miss out on. Let's get started. Here at number 10, we once again will be going with Hotba, just like in the previous video. It sounds crazy to have a guy on both the got better and got worse list for sure, but something you have to remember is that Hotba played on 4 different franchises in 5 years. Hotba's journey has been a pretty long one, so naturally he's had some struggles, of course. And the most fitting example comes in 2020 when he joined the New York Excelsior. You see, Hotba's expectations at the time were relatively high. He was coming off an outstanding year as a member of the Guangzhou Charge, and was seen as one of the better tanks available overall in the free agency class. And considering New York were still a pretty highly respected franchise at the time, it was very impressive to see Hotba get that kind of attention. I mean, to replace Mecco with him when Mecco was such a household name, that was a big deal. So naturally, the expectation was that Hotba would be a relatively big playmaker for the NYXL. However, we never really got any of that. Very early on, it was apparent that Hotba just was not the same player he once was, and the coaching also wasn't exactly helping. Not only was Hotba being exposed for some questionable gameplay, but in general, he was maybe not the best fit on a not very well-coached New York team. The NYXL during this time had a very tight focus on Jonek and the damage dealers while playing somewhat passively. The front line was supposed to play unselfishly with little resources given to them. However, Hotba, as we all know, is a rather resource-driven player, and I'd say that threw off the groove of the NYXL and what they're used to. Animo probably was dealing with some big headaches during the time, as he needed to be everywhere at once. Hotba was being very aggressive, which meant that Jonek was getting less help, but more importantly, Mono was being put on an island even more than usual. Hotba's poor scheme fit led to a significant downgrade in performance compared to the previous 2 years. It's not all his fault, but you could tell that a lot of it definitely did lie on him and his refusal to change his style, and a lot of the time he was catching a bunch of criticism. He certainly did lose some credibility at the time, and I'd say that his New York experiment overall was a failure. Hotba was a must-have on this list. Speaking of former New York players suffering, let's talk about number 9, where we have Myeongbong. That's right, a modern-day example for all of you new school people. It felt like Myeongbong definitely belonged here because he truly did take a massive fall compared to where he once was. In 2020, Myeongbong was a premier flex support, as he put the Boston Uprising on his back time and time again. He wasn't quite Roll-Star level, but he was the only 2020 All-Star from the West representing a team with a really bad record. Myeongbong truly was seen as an upcoming flex support god. All he really needed was a better team to show off his true potential, and here in the present, it finally seemed like he'd get that opportunity on the NYXL. The starting lineup had a decent bit of star power in theory, and Myeongbong's Ana play certainly could make a difference on that kind of team. But then the realization finally set in that there really are no guarantees in this league. This is by no means all his fault, because New York truly are a disaster, but man was he not helping their case. He forced an arguably better player in Gangnam Jin to off-roll, and he pretty much did nothing with that trust he was given. Before we knew it, rumors were swirling around that he wasn't just playing very poorly, but that the team was looking to replace him. And by the time we were just a couple of months into the year, they had signed Ho1 late June as a future replacement at flex support, and Ansoon Jae slid over to main support so Gangnam Jin could go back to flex. That's how desperate this team was to make a change. Myeongbong's time in New York ended up being very brief, as they let him go not too much longer afterwards. He lasted for about half of a season, then got the boot. He looked like a completely different player compared to his rookie year. He certainly took a big time fall, and we really don't know if we'll ever see him in the Overwatch League ever again now. This could be a sad end to what once looked like a very promising career for this guy. What a shame. Speaking of flex supports going downhill, let's get into a guy who underwent a different trajectory. At number 8, we have Bdocean. His first 2 years on the London Spitfire were very promising. He was extremely consistent, especially in that first year when he was arguably the second best flex support in the league, only behind Jonak. But as more talented flex supports started to join the league in 2019, his stock maybe started to fall. He was still reasonably good by the time we hit free agency, but the hype was maybe dying slowly in a way. In an effort to try and revive that hype and his career, he tried to run it back with former teammates Profit and Gesture to win another title, this time on the Seoul Dynasty. But sadly for him, he was never quite what the team needed, often being viewed as one of the weakest links on the starting lineup. That same explosiveness and reliability from years past was just nowhere to be found. It was especially disappointing to see him fall off from a flexibility standpoint though, because that's part of how he built a name for himself back in the early days of the Overwatch League. And now at this point in his career, he couldn't seem to do much right of anything. It's not a great sign when your main support is clearly better than you at both heroes in a BAP Brig meta. And just to add insult to injury, Seoul started playing their best Overwatch of the year during the 2020 playoffs when they benched him for the rookie creative. A trusted veteran with championship experience, mind you, had been thrown away for a rookie with little experience. Bdocean was just not the same championship player that he once was. In his new chapter on Seoul, he was nothing but average for the most part. And by the time we hit the 2021 offseason, he retired from professional play and has not come back since. Bdocean is a prime example of what it looks like to not be able to keep up with the times. Alright, that's just about everything on Bdocean, so how about we move on to a DPS? Let's change it up. At number 7 is Architect. And for me personally, this is one of the saddest fall-offs in Overwatch League history. Architect transitioning from the DPS of the future to a bench player is absolutely wild. Architect's story started off with promising beginnings when he joined the San Francisco Shock mid-2018. His impact was felt immediately thanks to his unreal mechanics and insane flexibility. He in all rights was the flex DPS of the future for this young core, and in 2019, he did kind of continue to prove that worth to a certain extent as he played a pivotal role in bringing home the Grand Finals trophy. But then came 2020, when Architect simply got tired of riding the bench. He requested a trade midway through 2020 and made his way to the Spark by May, where he would finally be a full-time starter once again. The goal of this trade was for Architect to become the shining star that put the Spark on the map, that one thing they were missing, if you will. And while there were some shining moments in his first year, especially early on, there were a lot of times where he just wasn't anything special in between. He was failing to adapt onto important meta heroes such as Echo and Tracer. He still mostly held his own, but there was a drop-off to a certain extent. Coming to a Spark team where he'd be reunited with Coach Supreme seemed like a blessing in disguise, but in reality, Architect just was not the same guy, and that only continued even further into 2021. With every passing moment, he was getting outshined by other flex DPS. His numbers were dipping significantly, and it was starting to become evident that maybe his time as a starter was coming to a close. The Spark were very mediocre in 2021, and he did little to impress outside of the June Joust qualifiers. And it was clear that the Spark knew this as well. Hence why they ended up replacing him this year with rookies alphaYi and Pineapple. Architect seemingly could not keep up with the times, just like Bdocean, and now finds himself sitting on the bench, with a future in this league looking very uncertain. Moving into the number 6 spot, we have Mecco. I want to make this one breezy because, to be honest with you, Mecco was put in a pretty garbage situation. But regardless, he has to make it on this list, as he was putting up Hall of Fame-worthy numbers on the NYXL. His D.Va and Sigma were just unreal levels of clutch, time after time, and to this day he still has some of the best numbers in league history. But unfortunately, his picture-perfect career went downhill when him and the NYXL decided to break up. Supposedly, Mecco wanted to play for a Western team. So he reached out to the Outlaws, and they ended up making a deal happen. And for a lot of you watching, you know just how notoriously bad the Outlaws were this year, so Mecco really ended up suffering big time. The DPS situation was a nightmare, the support line was shuffling around constantly, and Mumo was so bad that he got replaced by a DPS player at main tank. You're just begging to fail with that kind of system. This team won 7 games the whole year when including tournament matches. Mecco couldn't do jack to carry this team, and his numbers took a notable dip. You can defend him all you want for being put in a terrible situation, but he still wasn't the same player whether it's his fault or not. He was a star on the NYXL and mostly just an okay player on Houston. That's just how it goes. This was his choice. Never forget that. Anyway, looking into number 5, we have arguably one of the biggest fall-offs we've ever seen. That's right, I'm talking about Janu. In 2019, this man was on top of the world. He was easily a top 2 or maybe 3 off-tank in the entire world, and his diva play in the GOATS era was pure perfection. He was so dominant that he ended up making the MVP ballot that year. His diva and Roadhog were incredibly reliable, and there was absolutely no sign of him slowing down. But then of course came that fateful day in early 2020 when the Vancouver Titans completely imploded, leaving their entire roster without jobs. But luckily for Janu, he found his way to the Justice in a matter of weeks afterwards. His value in theory could have helped a struggling team like this get back on their feet. But sadly, that mostly didn't come true. The Justice had a terrible system in place, and he suffered. But also, a lot of the blame has to go on Janu himself. Individually, he was not that same guy from 1 year prior. The meta was fairly Sigma dependent that year, and Janu was pretty below average on him. Statistically, he just wasn't cutting it. I mean, he actually led the league in deaths per 10 on him in 2020, and was bottom tier in terms of damage. And if you think the numbers maybe get better on Diva or someone else, they really don't. So in a matter of months, Janu went from this league superstar to relatively washed up. And while it's true that he did play a pivotal role on Roadhog during Washington's playoff run, you have to remember that that was only 1 month of the year. In every other meta, he was just an average player and a shell of his former self. And by the end of 2020, Janu decided to hang it up and retire from professional play for good. So in a matter of 7 months, Janu's career completely derailed after starting over on the Washington Justice. That is absolutely insane. Coming in at number 4 is another guy who got a second chance in Washington. It's everybody's favorite wholesome main support, Arc. As a member of the original NYXL, he was one of the most respected main supports in all of Overwatch. He was the Mercy who never died. His calculated positioning and cautious nature were a huge part of why the 2018 NYXL were so stable. However, all of that changed as Mercy started to become weaker, and we went more towards a tank-heavy meta. Once main supports had to actually be proactive and not just hide behind their teammates in 2019, Arc's passive style of play no longer seemed to cut it. So Arc ended up getting benched and eventually traded to the Washington Justice, who were in desperate need of an upgrade at this position. In theory, this seemed like a pretty good move. Arc was still pretty respected within the community, and even though he was benched on New York, that wasn't the biggest deal seeing as Animo was also a pretty darn good player. Maybe Arc just needed to start somewhere else and get some actual playtime to show us that he's still good. But then the realization quickly set in that he was benched for a reason. And almost right from the jump, he was getting exposed as somebody who's way too passive for GOATs. He actually had to prove himself on Lucio and be aggressive, there was no hiding for him anywhere, and ultimately he failed big time. Arc maybe started to turn it around in stage 4 of 2019, but by then the Justice were cooked, and we all know the primary reason why they got better was because they were playing DPS again, so you can't even give him that much of the credit. And if you thought just the first year was bad, then you'd be sadly mistaken, because in 2020, Arc did more of the same. In return for a low death rate, he offered pretty much no contributions. Just across the board, no matter what he played, he felt very passive. He played so scared, and usually not with his team. The playoffs were like the only time he was somewhat decent. That's 1 good month of Overwatch in an entire year. He got exposed with having less playmakers to carry him. His style of play was less useful, and as his level of dependence went up and he had chances to prove himself, his relevance sadly went down. It's a very sad end for a very likable player. But guess what, Justice fans? We're not quite done with you just yet, because we have to include Roar on this list. Dear God, this was one of the worst pickups in League history. I'm sorry to say, but it's the truth. Roar, I'd say that he was never anything special from the moment he joined OWL. He had reasonably high expectations as a rookie, but he was just alright on the LA Gladiators. He showed flashes though, so there was maybe room for him to develop and do better in his second year. However, the Glads did not see that, so they shipped him off to the Justice where his career would literally go to die. Becoming the starter of Washington destroyed what he had worked for as a player. Would I say that it's all his fault? No, of course not. The Justice were a mess. But the fact of the matter is, Roar was a big reason why they couldn't escape the hole to begin with. His decision-making and over-aggression were suspect at best, and he simply was a non-factor for the most part when he took the stage. And it only got worse as time went on, as rumors started to swirl of Roar being a lazy, stubborn player who barely even practiced outside of scrims. He just didn't have the drive. So come playoff time, they straight up benched this dude. And literally the moment that he did get benched, this team played noticeably better. It's not all on him since the meta really just was a good fit, but there's no way that this is some sort of coincidence. Good comp or not, they took Decay off of DPS, where he was superstar level, mind you, just to avoid using Roar. I mean, lots of other teams at the time weren't even doing the double off tank stuff yet. They were still rolling with a Winston and other main tanks during this time. So the fact that Washington got unconventional shows you just how little they were trusting in this guy. The fact that he went from serviceable to one of the worst players in the league is pretty alarming, hence why he earns a spot on this list. And at number 2, we have, you guessed it, another Washington Justice main tank. This time, it's gonna be Janus. This video would be incomplete without one of the OG examples of a player going to a new team and failing. In 2018, Janus was a somewhat household name. He typically lived in the shadow of Mono, but was always serviceable for the NYXL on hybrid maps and whatnot. He had a very specific use, and he tended to execute with elegance. But since he was clearly a number 2 on a stacked roster like this, Janus was ready to spread his wings and fly as a starter somewhere else. Enter the Washington Justice, who paid this man a bag to sign with them. The idea was for Janus to come in, be the leader, and bring his ways to a young expansion franchise. But you know, some things end up sounding a lot better in our heads, and the Janus signing is a prime example. The man's Rhine in the GOATS era was not inspirational, and that's putting it nicely. Janus was the worst starting main tank from a statistical standpoint. His Rhine stats were literally all last. He couldn't make any individual plays happen when this team very much depended on his leadership. He was a clear-cut below-average main tank for league standards. To put it simply, his aggressive, resource-driven style did not work like it did on the NYXL. His teammates couldn't really keep up with him. Now, of course, it's definitely not all his fault like a bunch of other people on this list. The Justice were an awful GOATS team from top to bottom, but when you are considered clearly above average at your position coming into the year, you should probably still be better than 20th statistically. Other teams were arguably worse than the Justice, but you still managed to hit rock bottom. It wasn't until his teammates got better comfort picks and him being forced to kind of play more passively on Orisa that his luck finally started to change. And he surely was a world-class Orisa, I admit that, but it's irrelevant when looking at the big picture. He played well for a 7-game stretch when his team was already eliminated from the playoffs. That's it. He demonstrated his worth for 1/4 of the year, and it was in garbage time, so to speak. From respected to an average player at best. That goes to show you that he might have benefited from the system and that he maybe wasn't as adaptive as we once thought. He took a fall to a certain extent, and I really won't hear otherwise. And last, but certainly not least, at the number 1 spot, I have FD God. I want to give credit where it's due. FD was never an awful player at any point. However, his transition to the Shock was seen as a power move at the time. The expectations were sky high, but the partnership ended up being a letdown. Just 1 year prior, he was absolutely owning on the Paris Eternal, and he quickly established himself as one of the top support players in the league thanks to his insane Lucio and underrated Brigitte, and he even got a Roll Star award for all of his troubles. He was a rookie, but was already one of the best main supports this league had to offer. However, when the Paris Eternal imploded due to budget issues, he was forced to start anew, and on paper, he had the perfect new destination in store for him. He needed a new team, and the Shock were looking for a championship caliber main support. This, in theory, was a match made in heaven. The questions of how the Shock would survive without Moth were essentially gone, or so we thought. It wasn't right away, but after the first couple of months, it was very obvious that FD just wasn't the greatest fit for the Shock team, and as the season progressed, a weird synergy issue started to come into form. FD is known as a very aggressive main support, and that can be really good. However, on a Shock team where you're playing alongside Violet, that's maybe not an ideal style. It resulted in the support line having no sense of true balance. Moth was clearly what made that support line pop. His calculated nature was a great counterpart to Violet's "I'm going in" mentality. When you replace that with another aggro risk taker, you're left with something very reckless. These guys weren't protecting each other and keeping each other in check. Violet and FD were constantly getting picked. They weren't backing each other up. And outside of a rush meta, San Fran were absolutely paying the price for it, and it got to a point where FD straight up got benched for synergy purposes. The Shock would rather play Violet on main support when he had never played it at the time professionally over FD. What does that tell you? If that does not exemplify a loss in value, then I don't know what does. A once ideal partnership ended up being a failed experiment, and while not horrible individually, I'd say that FD definitely took a step back in terms of his play. Those non-Lucio metas in particular really hurt him. It was obvious that he had that one specific use. His style and versatility were a poor fit on the San Francisco Shock. At his peak, this guy was glorious, but compared to his year on the Shock, there was a massive difference. He went from a league superstar into one of the most hyped up free agent signings in league history to one of the most disappointing signings that we have ever known. And I think it's because there was so much hype surrounding him and he was so good in his first year that it makes sense to have him claim the #1 spot as somebody who really suffered after joining a new team. And with that said, that's going to do it for this video, ladies and gentlemen. If you enjoyed it and you want similar content just like it, consider checking out my top 10 players who got better after joining a new team video in the end card. And if you're new around here, you should totally hit the sub button if you want to stay up to date with all of my recent Overwatch League content. And until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.